Hi, everybody. Thank you for coming back. And you're here for another treat at Communicate Like You Give a Damn. I'm your host, Kim Clark. And is based in one of my bucket list cities. He's in Vancouver, Canada, British Columbia. And I have had that sitting on my bucket list way too long. So just to come and hang out with you is enough reason for me to jump the border. Matthew, thank you for being on this episode. And I'm really excited to have people learn from you and way that our departments need to be working together so that the whole organization can be consistent in communicating like we give a damn. With that setup, Matthew, please introduce yourself.
Absolutely. First off, before I introduce myself, I always say Vancouver is a great place to visit, but not the best to live in because the housing prices are
Aha.
wild, the rent prices are wild, but it's beautiful to visit, a good temporary stay. I'm just kidding. I grew up here, but I've definitely noticed a change over the past couple decades. But to introduce myself, my name is Matthew. My pronouns are he, him. I operate on the stolen and unceded territories of the Coast Salish peoples, specifically the Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, and Musqueam nations. And I'm the co-founder and partnerships cultivator at AndHumanity, which is an inclusive marketing communications agency.
Oh, so much to deconstruct just from your introduction. Yeah. One of the things that I love working with Canadian folks with is that idea of the land acknowledgement and going beyond the land acknowledgement, because
Absolutely.
it's so much more of a common practice than it is in the US. And you have the Truth and Reconciliation Act with 94 calls to action. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's kind of built into the culture, I know it's primarily focused around residential school survivors in the residential school system pointed towards government, but there are businesses within Canada. So, starting with the land acknowledgement and then incorporating the work to put action behind it, I know is something that is becoming more and more common in Canadian businesses.
Absolutely. One thing about land acknowledgements is, yes, I do notice it's a lot more common in Canada for a variety of reasons, TRC being one of them. But I also uh, realize that it's almost become so common to the point where it's lost a lot of its meaning
Mm.
behind the land acknowledgements. And one thing that I didn't do when I did my land acknowledgement is talk about what are the activities that we at AndHumanity are doing to um, actually push towards more truth and reconciliation. So one of the things that we do is anytime we work with a client that, for example, a tourism client or anything related to land, we always have advisors and what we call allies working with us in the process and following our principle of nothing about us without us. And I'll touch more on that later, but it's kind of something I've noticed is that the land acknowledgements have begun to lose more of its meaning because it's become more commonplace, if that makes sense.
Yeah, this is talking about how the land acknowledgement can kind of lose its umph if it becomes a little too normalized, as if we're not iterating on it. And
Absolutely.
that this a message that I tell communicators all the time. It's like, this isn't personal. This is about growth. It's just like, you can't be doing the same things and expect different results. But it's like, there's a reason why we're just continually iterating and improving. It's just, that is the natural course of things. So yes, if you've been doing a land acknowledgement, regardless of where you are in the world, you got to keep iterating on it and go beyond the land acknowledgement as well. So
Absolutely.
Matthew, you run an inclusive marketing firm out of Vancouver. So help us understand, like, what is inclusive marketing, and tell us about why you decided that setting up your own firm, what needs were you trying to meet and problems that you're trying to solve with your firm?
Yeah, absolutely. So our story started probably about 6 or 7 years ago. Myself and my sister are the co-founders of AndHumanity, and we were prior to that for about a decade. We were running a generalist marketing communications agency, a boutique shop here locally. And Tammy, my sister, came to me with this idea of an inclusive marketing. She was actually on parental leave at the time. Came to me with this idea and said, now that I'm about to have a child, I kind of started or had an epiphany, and it's like I kind of want to do something that has a little bit more, even more meaning. And what do you think about, inclusive marketing? It's not multicultural marketing, it's inclusive marketing. And kind of went to almost a whole pitch, kind of presenting to me. I was like, shouldn't you be on parental leave? Anyways, so she was like presenting this idea to me, and I loved it. And I my background before I was even in marketing was that I worked for a publication that was all about Asian representation in media. And Tammy's background before, starting the marketing journey with me, she used to work at the CCDI, which is the Canadian Center for Diversity and Inclusion. So it was kind of a merging of these, you can say, two industries, two ideas. So we both really liked it. So we went to Ad Age in New York, one of the Ad Week, sorry, in New York, which is one of the big conferences for brands, advertisers, and we wanted to float this idea. And this was back in 2018, 2017, 2019, around there. I don't remember the exact year, but point is that a lot of the feedback back then was, well, we see the moral imperative, but we don't really see a business case behind, an inclusive marketing. There wasn't a lot of buy-in. So we were a little bit obviously disappointed. So we decided, okay, we'll work on this off the side of our desk. We'll build what this agency is whilst, continuing on with our boutique generalist marketing agency. And COVID hit around, early 2020, January 2020, and we were losing clients every day from our generalist agency. So we looked at this, the silver lining wise, we finally had time. So we decided, okay, why don't we finally launch this agency we've been talking about? So long story short, we ended up launching. Very tepid feedback when we launched too, because it was, around March 2020, which was in the middle of COVID. Our clients didn't really, weren't really caring about what inclusive marketing agency it was. But I kid you not, probably a week or two after George Floyd was murdered in later that year, in around May or late May, then we started getting a lot of interest. What is inclusive marketing? How is it different than multicultural marketing? What is diversity, equity, inclusion? Like a lot of questions that, our contacts like CMOs, directors, marketing, don't really have a lot of background in. So there started to be a lot more interest in what we were doing. But one of the main reasons why we actually named ourselves AndHumanity was, even though there's an obvious business case, especially now, we never wanted to forget the humanity behind it. Because as people of color and as people that have been marginalized, especially in the advertising community, we always felt like, my own story was, I loved, superheroes growing up. And it was at a young age I realized I looked nothing like Superman, Batman, etc. And that really had an effect on me. It had so much an effect that, I started my own, short film production company that was all about Asian cast, Asian crew. I started my own comedy troupe, all Asian cast and crews comedy troupe. Like I did all that throughout my teens because I was trying to reconcile what had, which was actually turned out to be psychological trauma that happened when I was at a young age, and I didn't really give it its merit at the time. I was like, oh, it's not a big deal, but like my whole career kind of went towards that, including working for that publication that was all about Asian representation media. And I remember when the movie Shang-Chi came out, which was objectively for me like not my favorite movie, but I was like so proud that there was someone that looked like me that was put in a heroic role, right? So, and I think that people underestimate how much that matters, and people don't understand that marketers, advertisers, media, Hollywood, it's all interconnected, and we all have kind of a responsibility to showcase diversity in a true, authentic fashion, which we don't do because there's so much advertising in Hollywood, and everything is built on I guess foundations that have not changed for centuries, right? So anyway, so that's kind of, you can say, leads into our mission and our goal, and our purpose, which is, helping people belong.
Thank you. That's an incredible story. And I love your
Thank you.
salmon swimming upstream, like when everyone else is shutting down, you're opening up, and you would have not have ever known that you would be at the right place at the right time just a couple months later. Helping people navigate this new lexicon that needed to be a part of marketing campaigns. And so you've been in marketing for a minute. you you have a view, this perspective and viewpoint and experience of marketing as an industry, technologies, this fight for attention. How do you pop out and make sure you're not performative in your messaging from a marketing standpoint? Now, I keep a running Google Slides deck, Matthew, when I see headlines of examples of marketing gone sideways. And there's some really,
Yeah.
there's some really big examples in the States with Target last year and Pride,
Yeah.
and then
Yeah.
before that, Walmart with the ice cream and the Juneteenth ice
Yeah.
cream and the Pride ice cream at the same time. And it just goes on and on and on,
Absolutely.
department stores that have white people wearing t-shirts that say I'm black, be black. And it's just like the faux pas and the harm, the range of issues that can come out of marketing, not, just really missing the, what the challenges of where marketing is right now as an industry and trying to find its identity and its place in this larger conversation around social issues.
Yeah, it's funny that you mentioned this because I just saw someone post today on LinkedIn a opinion piece about I think the headline was "Purpose is out and humor is back in," and this was about the advertising industry or the marketing industry, which is a horrendous take. Like, granted, it was a screenshot, and I haven't read the article, but clickbait or not, that's a horrendous take, and uh, yesterday somebody shared with me a site that you know we all know lawmakers in the states are aggressively pushing more anti
Mm-hmm.
trans laws, and I think it's translegislation.com, and there's like a tally of them. And the state of marketing in general, diversity, equity, inclusion, investment in general is waning. And it's really sad because I remember in 2020 and then 2021, I felt like, hey, this is different. Like, it felt very different in the sense that, there were a lot of uh, innocent black people that were murdered before George Floyd that kind of had a spike, and then DI investment disappeared after that. And it was kind of like up and down, but there was something about 2020, maybe because it was overlapping with COVID and people were at home. I don't know what it was, but there's definitely something that felt different, that, hey, this has some staying power. Um, and unfortunately, with everything that happened in 2023, and you mentioned Target, I'm going to mention Bud Light too, where
Mm-hmm.
unfortunately you have a loud minority that is spinning what Bud Light has done in terms of supporting underrepresented groups into something negative, uh, and blaming it on the fact that they were being, too woke, when really why it failed was they didn't know how to follow through, and it was kind of a backpedaling issue, meaning Bud Light backpedaled, didn't really support. It was obvious that they were um, that it was a marketing campaign and that there was nothing behind their support of Dylan Mulvaney and the trans community. So, like, that was so harmful, I feel, to the industry, because I think people are now calling it "Don't Bud Light it up," or "Don't Bud Light it," or something like that. Like, it's become such a thing, that supporting underrepresented individuals in your campaign is now memed, right? And now joked about as potentially harming your brand. And I've seen and heard a lot of fear that shouldn't exist, but the fear exists because of that one large example of that happening, and a loud minority getting a major global brand to backpedal, which is, it's just so harmful and so sad. So the state right now is, I do feel it's a little bit better than 2023, but it is early. Uh, um, uh, and I feel like with everything that's going on, it's kind of, you can say, a downward trend in this investment, especially if that article that I saw the title to is kind of true. Um, and unfortunately, I feel that 2023 was a huge step back, and that in order for it to, start rising back up, people that work in inclusive marketing communications need to be strong and stay alive, and still exist. And people that work in on the brand side the ones that truly authentically believe in this work need to stand up for it, because I hear so much, well, this is put to my side of my desk. I don't have an actual budget for this. I don't actually have resources for this. I'm just the DEI chair. And it's like back to like pre 2020 is what I'm hearing, which is it's so sad. And so many people I talked around 2020, 2021, where there was so much energy. It's like, hey, I just got promoted because all the stuff that I was doing off the side of my desk, it's in my title now, and I'm doing it. I'm not just a marketer, I'm a DEI marketer. Like, they were getting promoted, they were getting supported and budget, and all that's being stripped away. And it's just, yeah, it's a really sad state. I'm sorry if it's if there's, maybe I'm being a little bit negative, but I really do feel that it's a sad state right now, and everything that's going on in the States is kind of proving that. I'm in Canada, it's not
I
much
mean,
better
and
here.
yeah, yeah, that's what it sounds like.
Yeah.
What's interesting to me is like, there's still money being spent on marketing campaigns. You still have to solve problems for organizations using marketing, and to just kind of toss away anything that may have been learned over the last 3 years.
I know.
It doesn't make any sense to me, because there's you still have to solve for it. There's still demographics. Marketing has a way of understanding communications, needs to be taking some notes on. So in communications, sometimes we throw out an organizational announcement or some sort of a DEI statement, and it's kind of like a one size fits all. Marketing doesn't do that. Marketing understands differentiated audience experiences. So to me, that just innately, you have to have DEI lens on your marketing campaigns to understand. If you have, going back to what UC Berkeley taught, and they have this framework, and I talk, and my co-author and I talk about it in the book as well. Targeted universalism is, you have this universal goal. So your organization needs to sell a certain amount of widgets. Now, the targeted part is looking at the different communities, demographics, psychographics, whoever that you're targeting. Where are they, and what do they need in order for them to be successful in purchasing your widgets to get you to that universal goal? It's going to be different for different demographics.
Yep.
Whether it's geographic or, whatever it is. All you're doing is adding a more nuance, like disability, LGBTQ+, into the messaging that encourages those targeted demographics to meet that universal goal. But you're doing it in an authentic way. That's the piece, to your point, was missing. It was just like, hey, try to get, gay men have lots of spendable money. Go after them, and let's make a lot of money off of them because they have disposable income. And it's like, you do have to get deeper than that. There's a genuine crisis part of that community on those accounts who know the community, like to your earlier guiding principle of nothing about us without us, and being able to speak to these demographics and make sure that your solution, your widget, your service, whatever it is meeting the needs of that community. And it's not just transactional, but actually relationship oriented. So, so something that I want the targeted audiences and how to speak to them, that is something we need to learn from our marketing buddies, and not try to do this one size fits all, because that's one of the reasons why our DEI messaging is not working effectively internally as well as externally. So tell us more, Matthew, about what you do with your clients to help guide them through. And have you had to work with them on altering any of the language to just kind of like let's go after the marketing budget that you do have and just kind of build it into the storyboard and the campaign itself when you don't have to necessarily call it out? Is that happening in your world? Or are you having to change any language? Like in comms, we're having to change the language.
Oh yeah.
Because the ultimate work is based on culture. The culture work, employee engagement, retention, all that kind of stuff, that is all still a business imperative. We've just been adding a DEI lens onto it and talking about it very openly, talking about DEI not in activities, but in outcomes. So we're having to change the language in some cultures. Some cultures are like, no, we have to openly talk about DEI. So again, going back to targeted messaging, like per organization, based on their level of maturation around DEI, we may have to change the language because we are understanding that language leads to behavior. So my question is really like, is that happening in the marketing world as well?
Yeah, absolutely. And we work in both the kind of the marketing communications, so it does happen. So yes, it is happening in the world. I actually spoke to someone recently, which I won't reveal the state of the name, but you could say it's a red state, and there was a lot of talk about we need to change. It is ultimately within the DEI realm, but we need to change it to use words like culture, belonging. You can't have diversity. You can't say the word equity. It's really odd, you can say, in terms of the request, but it's obviously coming from lawmakers and coming from people who are, it's a little bit scary right now in terms of investing that. So yeah, I am seeing a little bit of that right now.
So let's talk about when people are working in-house in organizations where there's a marketing department and a communications department. They don't necessarily always ladder into the same leader. They can be completely different leaders. How can communications and marketing be better partners and advocates within organizations in making sure that the messaging is in alignment?
Absolutely. So comms focuses more on language and creating compelling, stories. And marketing, and this is the way I'm dumbing it down, obviously, but marketing is more like reach and numbers. But I feel they're inherently tied together. Marketing success doesn't happen without effective and compelling comms. In my mind, they should be working closely together all the time. Like effective, inclusive marketing goes inside out. And what that means is that if you are uh, practicing inclusive practice internally, then it's easy to tell a story externally. People think they're separate, or people try to tell stories externally that are not happening internally. And that's where you get called out, and that's where that's happened before. Someone asked me once a question. How do we reach a more diverse audience? Like that was the question, which is a very marketing, like a question. It's like, I want to make sure I'm able to reach this audience. And I told them, like, I don't think reaching a diverse audience, it's reaching and actually engaging them is the problem. And we always say the first step and most ideal step to diversifying your audience starts from within. So if you demonstrate inclusion internally, you have an authentic story, then you'll have an authentic story to tell externally. One of the most uh, uh, incorrect or most common misconceptions or things that brands do is that they start by changing the focus of their messaging campaigns towards these underrepresented audience without doing anything internally with their products or their offerings, nor do they focus on crafting an authentic story about how their current products or offerings are ideal for those underrepresented audiences. So it seems very disconnected from the actual stories that they're telling. So we always say it starts from within, and I believe the work of comms is to tell these stories. Like, what is it that the brand is doing, and why is that interesting to underrepresented audience, or why is that compelling? And that's why I feel like they should be very aligned and work closely all the time.
Other ways that organizations can partner together with between communications and marketing is when it becomes around awareness months, cultural moments and observances, heritage months, history months.
Yeah.
Sometimes within organizations, comms will be working with employee resource groups, or they're the ones that have the budget that they're putting together some sort of social, some sort of campaign. I have all kinds of thoughts and opinions in other podcasts that I won't rehash here, but it's typically marketing or social within marketing that's actually doing the posting, and might incorporate into a product, like we were talking about Walmart with the ice cream, like it becomes a marketing product.
Yeah.
So how can communicators best work with marketing, and be involved in the conversation to make sure that there is a consistency of messaging when it comes around, particularly, cultural moments and observances?
Yeah. Dates of significance. I have a lot of, uh, you can say, thoughts on that as well. But how can communicators be more involved? I don't know the inner workings of every brand, but I do see the brands that are most successful is when there's integration and there's less separation. I will say that forthright, where sometimes they report to the same leader, which I like a lot, but oftentimes it is separate. But in terms of working together, I think when it comes to dates of significance, you need to be able to tell a story that is actually relevant to your brand, whilst also being interesting to your underrepresented audiences. And the issue with dates of significance is that it's often very surface level. What is produced? So products that are created on a whim for a specific date of significance happens all the time. There is no tie-in from the story side as to why this is relevant to the brand at a foundational level. It's a one-off piece or a one-off thing, and I feel like that's where marketing fails a lot, in the sense as that the storytelling piece behind where this ties into the brand is often, well, it's because it's Lunar New Year or it's because it's Black History. It's like that's not a reason, right? You're just promoting a product, right? You're not really talking about how this actually ties in and what you as a brand are doing internally, externally, and that's kind of thing. They have such a separation sometimes of internal versus external. It's like no, they're one and the same, and to one and the same in the sense that obviously internal communications marketing is different than external, but like they should overlap in terms of the storytelling, right? Because in this world where things get out, if you're not demonstrating internally what you are communicating externally, you will get called out. So you need to have that alignment. So I feel like there needs to be more of a merge there, or more of a yeah, unification, if that makes sense.
Can I just connect it to visual representation? We haven't
Absolutely.
really touched on that, and I think that's
Yeah.
something that marketing is very intentional about, whereas communicators can be less like, we could just be kind of like get things done, put it in a slide,
Yeah.
and not be is more intentional around the visual representation and the kind of visuals that you use. Can you talk a little bit about how you coach your clients, but also the recommendations that you make around visual representation and what point you're trying to make in the choices that you use when you're using visuals, whether it's photos or video?
Yeah, I would say a great question. I would say there's two parts to it. There's the output, and then there's the process. And I think so many times the focus is just on the output, the end video, the end product, etc. But inclusivity is a full circle approach, meaning that the process matters. So, for example, let's talk about photo and video shoots, right? We work with a lot of clients where uh, there is, for example, without naming any client names, there are clients where makeup artists or directors of photographies or photographers, etc., don't know how to create a psychologically safe space on set, right? And the output may end up being okay or serviceable, but it's that whole process that makes the brand inclusive or not, right? So there, we teach clients, whether it be training, consultation, etc., or implementing ourselves, how to make sure that we create brave, inclusive sets, and also the process and where there's so many things, but like power dynamics, for example. Uh, the creative field, or you can say the marketing field, it suffers a lot from power dynamics because there's subjectivity to it, in the sense of, like if you work in accounting, the numbers are the numbers, right? It's like that's right or that's wrong, like there's that. But oftentimes, especially in the creative industry, it's like, oh, if you're the creative director or the chief creative officer, you have that final say, even though you might not have the lived experience, or so the power dynamic is a huge factor when it comes to a subjective industry, like, or more subjective industry like creativity. So that whole process thing, in terms of creating inclusive content or visuals, etc., like that matters, right? And even sourcing design and graphic design, all that, there are different inclusive design practices and things which I won't get into it. So there's that part. The output now, which is obviously affected by the process, but the output is much easier to, you can say, visualize or see when it comes to something like a commercial. So going back to deep versus wide, we always try to tell deep stories, right? So deep stories meaning, hey, that's a very particularly culturally nuanced story or commercial about a specific underrepresented community. It's not generalized, it's not diluted. and that story is going to resonate with the mainstream audience, which is hard to convince brands sometimes. They're like, oh, we need to target everyone, or we need to target the mainstream, or we need to target, whatever. So if we sometimes suggest, let's focus on this one specific story from this underrepresented community, and we have to convince them that that actually has quote unquote mainstream appeal. And the only way we've been able to do that a lot of the times is showing them what's happening in Hollywood. Hollywood is a perfect example of, a lot of these movies and shows like Never Have I Ever, Heartstopper, Moonlight, whatever it may be. These would have been called Crazy Rich Asians. These would have been called way too niche a decade ago. But now they're hitting numbers at the box office, and people are realizing, oh, the global citizen, or you can say mainstream audiences, actually want to hear stories that are not about themselves, or that are actually about other people, that are culturally nuanced and authentic, etc. And it seems obvious when I say it now, but before, all movies or shows were often read, or were often rejected, at that producer level, because it was too niche, right? So going back to kind of the output there, when it comes to videos and commercials, and the output around that, we try to tell deep stories that are culturally nuanced. And on kind of the visual, more imagery side, um, it's hard to tell stories through just one image. Oftentimes, sometimes you can, but oftentimes one of the things that we try to focus on is being counter stereotypical. So if you look at a stock photo of, even when you're sourcing slides, so stock photos of people in a meeting, look at who is the one that is leading the meeting, who is the subordinate, simple things like that, who is in the position of power and who is not. Those are simple ways that you can just be counter stereotypical, and being counter stereotypical is being inclusive, because you are countering stereotypes which are harmful. So those are just kind of some of the ways that visually we make recommendations on.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. And some of the most overlooked is like body size,
Absolutely.
hair. There's so much representation that we're missing out on. And something that I explain to communicators is, if you're using a lot of stock footage and it's licensed by your marketing buddies, and you have to think about like what ends up in stock footage, like who is the creative director, to your earlier point, who are the photographers, who are the models that are showing up to the auditions, who are they casting, who's the casting director. So we're on the
Absolutely.
downstream of a lot of other people's
Yeah.
decision of what they think
Absolutely.
is going to sell. And then we're
Absolutely.
repurposing it and reaffirming what somebody else has decided is going to sell in our imagery. So we have to
Yeah.
be looking at, now there's emerging stock footage libraries that are very focused on
Yeah.
a wider variety of real people with different body sizes, skin tones, etc. And that's a beautiful thing. We're heading in that direction, which is going to help with the authenticity. One other thing you were
Yeah.
talking about, Hollywood. I was recently at a women's conference where Viola Davis came, and she was talking about how when she was producing, and they were finishing up the editing of Woman King, she said, you're talking about niche, how
Yeah.
movies and stories where, it's too niche that we can't, fund it or whatever it is. So she puts together Woman King, and she said we had to screen it to all white audiences to make
Wow.
sure it passed. And she said other movies that aren't all black casts do not go through this intentional extra step.
Yeah. Absolutely.
And so it's this white gaze,
Yeah.
GAZE,
Yeah.
that is placed on these stories to make
Oh,
sure that it
absolutely.
is palatable
Yeah.
to white audiences. So that's a food for thought right there.
Oh, absolutely. The white gaze in Hollywood. It's still like, I think the new movie with Leonardo DiCaprio, and
Oh,
Here I Am
Killers of the
Perpetuating.
Flower
Yeah,
Moon.
Killers of the Flower Moon. Yeah, they
Yeah.
were talking about how Ernest Burkhart was almost put in a positive light. Like he wasn't, but because he was white, like they almost try to make him a redeeming character. Like I haven't
Mm.
watched it yet, but that was what, because they did have Osage people consulting and part of the cast, and crew, but there's always this white. It's so hard to for them to, because they don't even see it. And I say they in a very generalized, but they don't even see it. But yeah, white gaze in Hollywood,
Yeah.
and there's
Hmm.
so many movies that I grew up watching that I thought were very diverse and inclusive, that I look back now is like, oh wow, no, that was horrible. That was horrible.
Well, and Viola
Yeah,
Davis
yeah,
has said that
yeah,
before as
yeah,
well. She
yeah.
regrets actually being in The Help for that
Oh
very
yeah,
reason.
absolutely,
Yeah,
absolutely.
and
Yeah, yeah,
which is and so what happened to the Osage also happened in Muskogee. So I did see it, and I was a mess. I was a mess afterwards. I really needed to. I drove around aimlessly for a long time. There was a lot of grieving
yeah,
because I was thinking of my great grandmother who was alive, and her mother during this time period, and she was given oil during the Dawes Act when they separated the tribe and gave them land that had oil on it. And the same kind of story. I mean, she wasn't like sickened or made ill or anything like that, but as far as like the withholding of the royalties from
yeah.
the oil and stuff like that, that's all part of my family story,
Oh, so
regrettably,
sorry.
but it's true. It's true. So I want it, to your point, to go deep, understand what these communities need, what they're, and how are you feeling, how are you fulfilling that need. And marketing has a real opportunity here, and it's those organizations that are going to continue in this work. They're going to be in way better positions when this storm blows over than the people who are pulling back or are not continuing to learn about what it is and putting it into their marketing. Because with the demographics changing, this is just one data point that if you're not keeping up with that, you are going to be severely disadvantaged. And marketing is like the first place, partnering with communications, that you've got to stay committed to this, because you're going to be in a way better position, as I said, as the storm passes. So how can people get in touch with you and work with you and follow you?
Absolutely. They can get in touch with me on LinkedIn. I try to post consistently in terms of different thoughts and content on inclusive marketing communications and Jedi, or justice, equity, diversity, inclusion in general. You could also reach our agency at us, that's us, at AndHumanity.ca. That's us at AndHumanity.ca. And lastly, I would just want to make a point, because I said this earlier. I might talk about this earlier, um, but failed to mention that even though the state right now in 2024 is quite depressing, and you caught me at a time where I was reading a lot of articles on it. I do want to say too that, and I've always affirmed this, that the younger generations, or you can say Gen Z, Gen Alpha, more so, um, uh, things don't change the marketing industry until um, often until the bottom line is affected. And I think Gen Z, Gen Alpha will use their marketing or their disposable income to change brand stance on this work, to emphasize how important it is, because there's a lot of data supporting this. But even qualitatively, me speaking to people from the younger generations, they don't understand why diversity, why brands are still greenwashing, pinkwashing, or why they're so performative. They can spell performative advertising and marketing from a mile away. Like, there's a disconnect. Just like when I was going through my marketing career, and I was like, why is digital not being focused on? Like, we were that side small digital agents. Like, why are people not focusing on their website? Like, it actually didn't make sense to me, because I was kind of too young to understand, the generational difference and why. But now I can kind of see it happening again with this younger generation being like almost like, if you want to appeal to us, it's very simple, do the work, right? And we want and what's really great, I think, about this generation, and I'm from the kind of an older millennial, that I didn't even understand, is like the necessity of brands and advertisers being part of their lives. It's not a, oh, let's, cut, advertising. It's like, no, I actually am so unfortunately, maybe they're so used to seeing advertising and marketing that they don't mind it. They mind it when it's inauthentic, and they mind it when it's not related to what they're doing, or it just seems so off. It's like you're not understanding them. They want to be related to. So I think diversity, equity, inclusion, although it seems right now that the investment is waning, I really do believe that the younger generation is going to pull it back into hopefully, the 2020, 2021 kind of stages when they become more, they have more buying power, etc. And maybe this is a very uh, pessimistic view of it, or a very, but that's just what I feel will happen, just like it happened with the digital age.
Brands and organizations are only hurting themselves by pulling
Absolutely.
back.
Only hurting
Absolutely.
themselves.
So I ask this question, Matthew, of every guest. So I'm really interested to hear what your thoughts are on this. But what does communicating like you give a damn sound like, look like? And please tie it into what inclusive marketing looks like and sounds like.
Yeah. So I had to think about this because obviously I know the name of the podcast and things like that. And I was, first of all, I completely agree. And you've said this before many times in your previous webinars, podcasts, which I follow. Language and words have so much power and impact, so much that we often overlook the importance of it. And Humanity has a blog post right now up called "Sticks and Stones: The Most Harmful Language in Communications is Often Subtle." And it highlights a headline, going back to Bud Light, a headline where it ended off with saying, Bud Light, the whole Bud Light controversy, and then transgender promotion costs sales, right? And that was the end of the headline. So what it implied, even though the content was exactly blaming the transgender promotion, that's what the headline was. But that's such a subtle shift in the language to put the blame on transgender promotion when we all know, well, not we all know, but when we inclusive marketers and communicators know that's not the reason why it became a thing. There was another example in that blog post where it shows a story where Indigenous women in Canada have been forcibly sterilized for decades. And in this case, it was a misinterpretation of nonverbal communication that contributed to this issue. Like, and the example that they showed was, or they shared was, in Inuit culture, people often communicate with facial expressions. For example, raising their eyebrows means yes, or wrinkling their nose means no. But doctors who are not familiar with the way they communicate will be speaking and they look to the person to acknowledge something and they'll raise their eyebrows saying yes, but the doctor will label that as non-responsive. So you can imagine, especially in healthcare where things are so vital, it's literally life and death sometimes, how harmful that is when there's that miscommunication. So communicating like I give a damn to me has many things, and I'll kind of go back to the approach that we have. First of all, it's nothing about us without us, which means you cannot communicate on behalf of someone else if you don't have that lived experience. And that goes to marketers and communicators in terms of when they're um, promoting anything. You have to follow nothing but us without us. Another thing I like to that we like to focus on is going deep and not wide. So the idea behind going deep and not wide is that oftentimes brands are so focused on hitting every single date of significance, like Black History Month, it's Lunar New Year, then it's this, then it's that, and then it's Pride Month, etc., that they're not going deep with any of this work, and all they're doing is, surface level, very wide. But we always say going deep means more resources, means more accountability, means more actual intentional work done for a specific community is way more effective than going wide and uses the same amount of resources because you're focusing on, very deep focus on, say, the 2S LGBTQIA plus community. You're doing something for Pride Month, but it's stuff that's happening internally and externally, and you can tell a fulsome story because you're not just changing your logo to a rainbow, right? Like, so going deep, not wide, is important. And lastly, especially when it comes to communicating like you give a damn, impact is more important than intent, right? Like, and that's something that's confused a lot. And I hear it a lot, especially from people who use harmful language or harmful. It's like, oh, I didn't mean to. I'm sorry. And it's okay to make a mistake and apologize, but it doesn't absolve you of the impact that you make. And brands often will have missteps, and there's often sometimes like kind of a you can say a recklessness to it, because again, I think words have so much impact, and communication in general has so much impact, that there's sort of recklessness that people are not making sure that they're not causing harmful impact because their intent is period. And I always say we don't live in a world where there's superheroes and villains, right? Very few people I know go, yeah, I had, I had harmful intent. Like, no, that's not what they did. Most people have good intent, but that doesn't absolve you from the negative impact that you do make. So I think those are kind of, you could say, the key things that I would say are making sure you communicate like you give a damn.
Matthew, thank you so much for sharing. So, what popped out to you from the conversation? The more conscious communicators in the world, the better the world. So go to communicatelikeyougiveadamnpodcast.com and set up a one-on-one strategy session. And until next time, let's keep taking care of each other.